Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at Morphy's taking a look at a Mauser K98k. So you may be thinking it's German, but it's not. It is French, of course. This is one of the Kar98ks that was manufactured at the Mauser factory in late 1945 to early 1946 under its French occupation administration. And there were actually quite a lot of these, and they are floating around on the US collector's market like this one, and I think it's a pretty cool story. So, of course, the Mauser factory is occupied by the Allies in April of 1945, and it ceases to produce rifles for the German army at that point. But it had been in full-scale production right up to basically the moment that Allied troops walked onto the factory grounds. They were continuing to produce parts in advance, like the regular standard production was going on as best they could, dealing with the various implications of Allied bombing campaigns and supply shortages and all those sorts of wartime exigencies. But essentially, Allies walk onto the factory grounds, they just turn off all the machines and it shuts down there. The factory ends up under French occupation, and by May of 1945, so barely a month later, the French have restarted all of the machinery. They've restarted production on a number of the different firearms production lines because the French army is in very substantial need of small arms. They, of course, don't have access, or haven't until very recently at this point, had access to their own production centers in France. All the French arsenals were under German control throughout the majority of the war. France wants to rebuild its army, both to reassert its colonial presence in places like Indochina. We'll see rifles like this absolutely be used in Indochina very quickly. But they also want to make sure that they have a full seat at the table in post-war decision-making in Europe. They want to make sure that they are treated as a real player in the war, as a full-fledged combatant nation, despite the fact that there was the armistice with the Germans and France was largely out of the war for much of the war. At any rate, this leads them to need small arms. Hey, look, here's a huge factory complex making small arms, and we're in charge of it, so guess what? Now you're making guns for us. And the primary thing that they would manufacture is actually the Kar98k Mausers. They did also make some pistols. We'll touch on those in separate videos, but in total, this production would last until the spring to early summer of 1946. The French would manufacture about just under 52,000 new Kar98ks, or the Germans would manufacture them for the French, as well as doing some refurbishment of other rifles. So there are a couple different things that we need to take a look at here, because the transition from German production to French production is messy when you try to get down to the really nitty-gritty details. So let's take a closer look. All right, so this is a K98k, so of course we're going to start with receiver markings. We have model 98, naturally, and then we have the factory code. The Germans, of course, used a series of factory code letter designations to try and obfuscate where they were making guns, and the codes changed from time to time through the war. So Mauser used like half a dozen of them over the course of their K98k production. Late in the war, they were using BYF and a two-year date code. At the very end, they switch in 1945 to SVW45. And the Germans would actually make, they got into the B serial number range of SVW45. All the SVW45s are all German made, they're A and B prefix. And then at about somewhere between 5,500 and 6,000 B, Bravo, they changed the code to be MB instead of 45. Now, there are some people out there, I think, who only associate that svwMB with the French occupation guns and think that perhaps it's something the French instituted. It's not. This was originally a German production code, and svwMB guns in the B series are generally all found with German proof marks on them. So you would expect to see a Waffenamt here. Now there are ultimately 4 different patterns of these svwMB guns that you can run into. Type 1 is a fully German-produced, German-proofed gun that was actually shipped to the German military before the factory was occupied. Those are generally going to be the lower serial number ones, but it's important to point out here that Mauser had sort of a non-linear production system going on, and the order that guns came out of the factory was not strictly the same as the order of the serial numbers. So once we get into svwMB C serial number range, and that's what this one is, we have 12,000 Charlie here, then we see a mixture of German and French guns. And so the first ones are going to be guns that were actually finished awaiting inspection and final proofing when the factory was shut down, when it was occupied, and then of course when the French restarted it. So you'll find guns that have German inspection marks on the parts, but this 5-pointed star instead of a Waffenamt. That 5-pointed star is what the French chose to use as their military inspection mark. If you're into French arms, you may recognize this as the same thing that you'll see on the bottom of ruby pistols, for example, to indicate military acceptance of those in the First World War. Anyway, they go back to a 5-pointed star. The third pattern of these rifles you will see are ones where there are no German inspections on them at all. They are all guns that were manufactured or assembled under French control, given a French inspection mark, and sent out the door that way. And then the fourth version are guns that have French modifications to them, like this. Now we'll get to this in a moment. First though, let's talk for just a moment about what this rifle really was. This is a Kriegsmodell. So Kriegsmodell is the sort of official name of the German last-ditch standard pattern of the Mauser K98k. It has a number of modifications that were made to simplify it, to reduce the cost, that sort of thing. So standard K98Ks will have a metal disc back here with a hole in it. That was used as part of the disassembly process for removing the firing pin. They replaced that with just a drilled hole through the buttstock and butt plate down here. So we've got that. That's a Kriegsmodell feature. With the Kriegsmodell system, they start getting into a bunch of stamped sheet metal parts. You can see here the trigger guard is made of multiple stamped pieces. So we've got this inside ring that's a stamping that's sort of crimped inside the outer ring of the trigger guard here. The floor plate on this rifle is marked BYF. That was one of the earlier German code sequences for Mauser. The trigger guard itself is marked SVW. It's important to point out, like the scale of manufacture at Mauser was, I think, to many people, mind-boggling. They were producing, for example, barrels 3 to 4 months in advance of complete rifles. So all of the barrels for these French assembled rifles were already manufactured by Mauser, many of them back in 1944. When the French came in, they did an inventory of what was still at the plant, and they found 397 tons of K98k parts. Allegedly, they found 13 million parts in various levels of manufacture. So they had a lot of stuff to work with, and that's why you will see parts in here that have sometimes obsolete for the time production codes, because there were still pallets of these floor plates that had already been produced at Mauser and were used in these rifles. All right, moving on down the rifle a bit, we have mostly the changes to this were reductions in the final fit and finish quality, and some of the furniture changed. So here, our barrel band is also stamped, and then fairly crudely welded together, we have a stamped front nose cap here, which is also rather, this one's welded a little bit better, but you've got a weld on the bottom of the nose cap. Originally, the K98k had a pair of springs that would hold these parts in place. They didn't bother making the springs. Like, that's a simplification. We can get rid of the springs. There's still a hole on the nose cap here for the retention spring that would have been in an earlier pattern of the rifle, but now they just drilled a second hole, screwed it into the stock. Same thing with the barrel band here. It's just held in place by a little wood screw. So those are standard Kriegsmodell parts. And then as originally produced at Mauser, this would have had nothing out here. So Kriegsmodells didn't have cleaning rods, and they didn't have bayonet lugs on them. That was just not relevant enough to spend the time making. So that's what this rifle began as. Now, at some point after it was manufactured for the French, it was refurbished by the French. They went back through and rebuilt a bunch of these guns, and they made two major modifications. One of them is the addition of this stacking rod. So it's a hexagonal piece here. This is actually a wood screw that's just screwed into the hole that would have originally held a cleaning rod down in here. and then there's a section of rod. This isn't a usable cleaning rod, it's just a rod. It's used as a stacking rod, and it's on there almost certainly because all of the other French rifles at this time still had stacking rods. So it was part of their standard infantry doctrine. The point of this is so that you can take 3 rifles and stack them up together so they're standing in a little tripod on the buttstock so that they don't lay down in the dirt and get dirty when troops are at rest for whatever reason. When they can't carry the rifles, they can stack them using these rods. So the French added this at some point, and we don't know exactly when, but it is distinctive, it's very distinctive of these French occupation production Mausers. Then the other thing the French did was cut this scooped out slot in the stock and attached this bar, and this was for the use of a standard French infantry rifle sling. So you'll often see these with French slings on them. This particular one has a German sling on it now. They all retained the slot here so they could be fitted with a German sling, but the other French refurb was to set them up so they could use a standard French sling, and you'll often find these rifles with French slings on them. Now, the one other thing that I will point out here is the French ground off the serial numbers on the bolts and re-stamped them. So it appears when the French rebuilt these rifles, they pulled the bolts out, rebuilt, did whatever they needed to do to the receivers, whether it was refinishing, potentially rebarreling, although I don't think they actually rebarreled any of them. They did their work, and then they just threw new bolts in the guns and force matched the bolts to the receivers. So the original German serial number would have, for example, had the letter suffix in there. This is 12613 Charlie. The French simply put the last 3 digits of the serial number onto the bolt. You can see that it's been the original serial number has been ground off, and you can also see that the other parts serialized on the bolt assembly here are mismatched, and that's typical of the French rebuilds of these guns. I want to follow up just a bit here on the serial number. The Charlie series will run from 1 out to 29,000, which is a little bit odd. We normally expect German rifles to have 10,000, batches of 10,000. They'd start 1A and go to 9999A and then start over at B. These go into 5-digit numbers, and there is some people out there suggest that the suffix is actually the month of production, making this a March number, a receiver that was produced and numbered in March of 45. I see varying, conflicting thoughts on that. I can't confirm it, I can't deny it. I don't know. I'll present it out there as a theory for you guys. After Charlie, we do see a D series, and then H, and then K. So they skip a bunch of the numbers, which does seem to potentially support this idea that the letter suffix is a production month. It would go out to 12. At any rate, A and B are going to be German production, German army, German inspected guns, and you wouldn't expect to see them with a French star. The C is completely mixed. Like I said, the Mauser production wasn't strictly linear, and so there is no actual cutoff of where in C the German ones stopped and the French ones started. They're just intermingled. However, D, H, and K are all thoroughly French production batches. By the spring of 1946, there is an Allied agreement not to produce small arms on German soil. The French, I'm assuming, probably kind of want to keep doing it, but the Russians start getting angry that the French are, in fact, continuing to do this. And so the French will ultimately cease their operations at Mauser. The last guns are actually assembled in April of 1946, and then there's another about 2 months of time when the Mauser factory is packaging and shipping guns. And the last deliveries of guns out of Mauser to the French are in June of 1946. After that, the French will leave. They will take a bunch of the machine tools with them to use themselves. They will blow up a bunch of the buildings of the Mauser factory complex, pretty much just out of spite to make sure that nobody else can use them. And then they go home. We'll talk about the P-38s later. The P-38 was really the one gun where they actually took parts with them and finished them in France. But again, that's a subject for a separate video. That leaves them with 50,000 plus new Mauser rifles. Those are put to good use. This is sort of an interim weapon for the French. Like I said, we do see these used in Indochina. They're a good rifle to issue to often second-line troops, to local, in the colonies, these would be issued to local forces that you want to arm, but you're not willing, you don't expect a lot of them, and you don't want to give them the new hot off the production line stuff that needs to go to your own top-tier troops. So this is sort of a backup weapon. It's an alternative option for the French. And like I said, we see them in the US on the US collector's market today. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, especially now that you know the difference between how the French originally made them and how they're often recognized today with the French stacking bar and sling bar. Yeah, big thanks to Morphes for giving me access to this particular one to show to you guys. Thanks for watching.